Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Performance Café. And today I have an extra special guest that I'm so pleased to introduce to you, and his name is David Houle. David is a former media and entertainment executive whose work has won Emmys, a Peabody, and an Academy Award nomination. Today he is better known for his role as the CEOs Futurist. Amongst others, he's Futurist in Residence and guest lecturer at the Ringling College of Art and Design. He is honorary president and futurist of the Future Business School of China, and he's co-founder and managing director of the Sarasota Institute, a 21st century think tank. So welcome, David. It is great to have you here with us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. So before we get started, I just wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did we get from media executive to futurist?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm an only child, and so I've always was kind of looking out to the world a lot more than other kids, I guess. And I've always done things that people said wouldn't work or were stupid to do. And I didn't really realize that till this century, but I graduated from college. I wanted to live in a van. So I went and lived in a van, and nobody did that at the time. It's like, why are you going to go do that? And then 3 years later, everybody was living in a van, and I was backpacking overland over Asia. It's like, why do I want to do that? You can take that money and buy a house. Well, I wanted to go around the world, right? And then fast forward to the 1980, I was the #1 sales executive in Chicago for CBS, which was the #1 network at the time, broadcast network. And I took literally a 50% pay cut to go join the team that created and launched MTV, Nickelodeon, VH1, CNN Headline News. And at that time, cable was in 10% of the country. So cable never worked. What do you mean video music? What do you mean a 24-hour news channel? No one's going to watch that. What do you mean? So I was right. And then in the late 90s, I basically was managing director of one of the very first startup companies creating online courses. Online courses, that'll never work, right? So it wasn't until the early part of this century where, after having given some speeches out in Berkeley, and I hadn't read all the great futurists of the last 75 years, I said, well, I should be a futurist because that's what I'm doing. I'm being a catalyst to get people to think about the future and facilitate it. So that was like 16 years ago. And so then I started writing a blog, and then I, wrote the first of what is now 9 books. And the one that really put me on the map was The Shift Age, because I said I'd come up, we've left the information age and moved to the shift age somewhere around the middle part of the first decade of this century, 2005, 2006. And we're still in it until probably towards the end of this decade. So that's how I became a futurist, because I'm always fascinated by what's next. I have a low boredom threshold. Other than this job, I've never been in a job for more than 3 or 4 years because I master it and it's boring, right?
Yeah, yes, and I'm sure the future keeps you plenty busy.
Yeah, exactly.
In your book, 2020, The Most Disruptive Age in History, you speak of disruption and uncertainty as a constant. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's really interesting how humans have a misperception of the concept of change. The only constant in the universe is change, right? If there wasn't change, there wouldn't be time, because time measures change, right? So change is the only constant. People tend to think that reality is fixed, and that's where they get hung up. Because, the obvious example, speaking to you in the 9th month of 2020, is look how different reality was than a year ago or even 9 months ago. So I've always said to people before I get up on stage, when I used to get up on stage, I want you to suspend what you think reality is, because otherwise you can't open up for me to show you what it's going to be. So just like the concept of security, there is no such thing, and there's no such thing as reality, except that it's changing. So that's basically it. I always like to go to rock and roll, which is Bob Dylan. Those not busy being born are busy dying. So are you being busy being born today? If not, you're dying because you're living your life over from yesterday, right? So I always try to do things differently. I'm really into workout routine now. The workout's never the same, because it's like people who travel. You know, when you travel, you're much more aware because it's unfamiliar. I mean, you can walk from your house to your car and not see anything because it's automatic. But the minute you travel is, oh, this is different. This is different. You're paying more attention. I try to bring that consciousness of travel into each day's life. Like, oh, I'm going to go a different way, or I'm going to, it brings your attention to the moment. And what people need to understand is the future happens in the now, right? It's only moment to moment to moment. So you can't see the future unless you are present in the now and you see the trends coming into the now and where they're going up and where they're going down.
I hear you. So I suppose the question is, having read, and I know we're going to one day speak about the 2020s, but one of the concepts in the book is you speak of all of a sudden there's globalization. It's all about the individual. How are we going to have to change our worldviews to adjust to this new normal of constant disruption?
Well, so reality as it exists is based on thoughts from the past. So I talk about this concept of the collapse of legacy thinking. Legacy thinking's from the past. An oversimplified way to think about it is that most of humanity, particularly if you're over the age of 40, have powered into the 21st century with 20th century conceptual constructs. So we're looking through the filter of the past. And the problem with that is that we are now at the global stage of human evolution. So many people think of globalism as just an economic thing and the interdependencies. And so it's really, we've gone from family to tribe to village to city state to nation state. And our only remaining boundaries are planetary. So we're right in that difficult place where we have to move to a global sense of coordinated activity. And we have a global coming of consciousness. We can talk about that perhaps next time, because I know we want to focus on how to increase performance. But basically, the highest level is that there is no major issue facing humanity that isn't global in scope, whether it's climate change, financial inequality, migration, immigration, natural resources, things like that. So we have to think of it that way. We are in the largest evolutionary viewpoint. We are in the global stage of human evolution, so that means that we have to move from the other, which is, oh, you're Russian, I'm American, you're South African, he's Moroccan. We have to lift that up to move from the other consciousness to the collective we consciousness. Like in climate, I launched a nonprofit and wrote a book, This Spaceship Earth. Crew consciousness, as Marshall McLuhan said around the first Earth Day in 1970, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. So we have to crew the only spaceship and the only place we can live, called Spaceship Earth, right? So that's a global consciousness, and that extends to everything.
So this is an interesting thing, because you provided me with a couple of very nice links. Thank you very much, that I looked into. And one of the things that came up was Black Lives Matter. And right. I think that's the point that you were making about racism is not a thing in a country. I'm sure genderism and sexism and everything, it isn't any more limited there. Everything is global. So what does this mean for how we see businesses and how we manage people from this global perspective?
Well, if I have a spiritual grounding, it's in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And Buddhism basically says that the root of all suffering is the illusion of separateness. In other words, David Houle, man in Florida, talking to innocent woman in South Africa, and we're two different. But on a higher level, we're one and the same. We have almost identical DNA. We are part of consciousness. We're part of the human race. We're part of the planetary ecology of Spaceship Earth. So we have to understand that sooner or later as I wrote in The Shift Age, the three forces of the shift age are the flow to global, the flow to the individual, and both of them are powered by the accelerated electronic connectedness of the planet. So we're getting organized around all of us. At the same time, each of us is more powerful than individuals have ever been, because, like, for example, we're doing this, and 15 years ago, we'd have to be on a major network to have this conversation, right? Excuse me. So the idea is that at the same time we're getting organized around the collective, we're getting organized around the individual. And those two forces, as I said, are accelerated by electronic connectedness. And the point is that all those structures in the middle, nation states, counties, states, they're all corporations, they're all subsets they're made up of individuals, but they're collectively connected. So that is where it's moving. So in order to manage that, you have to be able to manage the concept of, it's like, for example, why corporate culture is so much more important than it's ever been, because there's self-identification going on. I want to work with people who have the same passion I do, or are like me, or are complementary to me. And there's a recognition of a collectiveness that's more important than a hierarchy. In other words, hierarchies are 20th century. Centralization is 20th century. Decentralization and dispersion is the 21st century.
So how do we, coming back to this whole concept of constant change, how do we set teams up for success? Am I still going to be setting goals and, KPIs, KPAs?
Yeah, so I'm unique, as I told you at the outset. I'm an only child. I'm a kind of a lone wolf, So there's that line. There's no I in teams, and I always say, well, that's why I don't join teams, right? So I'm not really the best person to talk about teamwork, but the teamwork has changed in the sense that if you want performance, it used to be, the model of the military model. We're going to mold you into a fighting machine. You're all going to be dehumanized and then reconstructed back up into a team. And what teams are more nowadays is recognizing the individual assets and trying to, the individual talents, individual proclivities, individual passions, and integrate them so they're more dynamic than usual. Rather, a team isn't 10 players doing the same thing. These days, it's 10 players who are complementary. So somebody, there's the techie, or there's the free thinker, or there's the person who's passionate about, or there's the person who's really good with detail, or and so management is about integration to get to greater than the whole, than subjecting everybody to be like everyone else. So the corporate culture is collapsed in the sense of conformity. I mean, that's why I can't stand, this thing is how our worldview to adjust to the new normal. There's no such thing as normal. Normal was a word that was created in the mass market 100 years ago. So here's normal, everybody eats Wonder Bread. Everybody has a white picket fence. Everybody has 2 cars, right? There is no such thing as normal, right? I mean, you're not normal. I'm not normal. We're individuals and we're collected as humans, right? So the point is that the only normal that exists now is abnormality, right? Given COVID, I mean, COVID is an abnormal thing, and yet this is how we are reacting, right? So the point is that there is no such thing as normal, just like there is no such thing as reality, just like there is no such thing as security, except it's perceptions that we have that.
Wonderful. So then my question is, if everything is going to be disruption, if everything is going to be chaos, is innovation going to save us?
Well, I think you know what I'm going to say about this, which I'm going to take down the word. Innovation is an out-of-date word. It's a word that came into being in the 90s, right? In .com 1.0, innovate, right? But since everybody says they're providing innovative solutions, then nobody's providing innovative solutions. If innovation is the baseline, then innovation is irrelevant. In a time of disruption and transformation, innovation is only iterative change. So I understand the questions within the context of, can we change fast enough? And I would use the word, I always, when I present to corporate CEOs, I say, don't use the word disruption. And I say it's iterative change. And then the last line that I put up is, what is going to disrupt you? So instead of thinking, oh, we have to be innovative, the question is there something out there that can disrupt our product line, our business processes, our business construct, the way we do business and how we do business? And that's essential, because the minute you think you have it together, you don't. The people who have failed the biggest are corporations that thought they were at the top, Kodak being the example. Oh, we're a film company, and then digital, photography came along, or we're a mainframe computer company, right? So the point being that the phrase I like to use, the example I like to use, people always identify Steve Jobs as an innovator. He wasn't an innovator, right? Back in the day when he announced the iPhone in 2007, the dominant phone was the BlackBerry. So it's a screen with keyboard, right? So if an innovation would have just been a BlackBerry with a bigger screen. Instead, he came up with a whole new disruptive technology, the touchpad, right? So that's an example. He was a disruptor. He was a transformative guy. He wasn't an innovator. Innovation is an out-of-date word. Don't use it.
Lesson learned. So no, I'm with you. I didn't know where we were going with that. So it reminds me a bit of Henry Ford, who one day said that he doesn't think much of customer feedback. He said, because if I asked my customers, they'd ask for faster horses.
Right.
And he gave them a car.
And he also, but he was the epicenter of constructing what became 20th century mentality. He said the customers can have any color car they want as long as it's black. Right. That was the first one. Right. And exactly. And I put on in every single power presentation I used to do, and I still do them, I guess, here, is I put up the picture of Manhattan, Fifth Avenue, Easter morning, and the phrase is, spot the car, because there's only one. There's all horse and buggies. Yes. Then I put up the slide from 1913, 13 years later, and the phrase is, spot the horse, and there isn't one. So the point is, in a 13-year period, when the speed of change was a fraction of what it is now, they went from 100% horse and buggy to 100% cars. The second reason I put that up, and this is, since you brought up Ford, you're stuck with this, but if you lived in Manhattan in 1900, and I always ask the audiences, I used to say, so what was the number one environmental hazard if you lived in Manhattan in 1900? And they'll say horse manure or some variation of the phrase, right? And the solution at that point was a canvas and leather bag that was strapped onto the back of the horse. So at the end of the day, they just go to the west side of Manhattan, drop the horse manure into the Hudson, because that's what you did with rivers more than 100 years ago. They didn't understand that the solution to horse manure was a new drivetrain, right? So they couldn't see getting rid of something that was physical, but a whole drivetrain replaced it. So I always say to people, don't think that you can take existing solutions and project them into the future. The example I always use, because it's so obvious, is there's a couple of women who've set up nonprofits to teach young girls, like age 10 around there, how to code, because coding is such a guy-veiled business, right? The problem with that is when these girls graduate from high school, let alone college, there won't be any coding jobs because machines are self-coding, right? It's kind of like my father, who worked his way through college in the Depression by typing rich kids' term papers, made me learn how to type. But at the time I learned how to type, the only thing I could have gotten was a job in the typing pool, and men didn't do that, right? So it's kind of like one of those models. So the point I'm trying to say is that's where innovation goes slowly. Henry Ford disrupted the horse and buggy. Steve Jobs disrupted the handheld device. So it is disruption. So I would say innovation is not going to save you. Paying attention to answering the question, what might disrupt you, is a better way to start.
Okay. Loving that. So now I've got to ask you this question. You reference innovation exhaustion in your book. How does that translate to the workforce?
The only way to not experience change is to always be changing, right? If you're in a state of change, you can't feel the change because you're in it. It's only when you are holding on to a construct that you invented sometime prior to this moment. So you're taking the past into this moment to the degree that you have, and I always like to say this, points of view is the degree to which you won't see reality. You know, if you hold a point of view, believe in this party or root for this team or have this self-identity, then you're going to hold on to that. So you're going to become exhausted when you're forced to change because you're spending so much energy on holding on to what you think reality is and who you think you are. If you think you're the same person today than you were yesterday, why have you bothered staying alive? Right? I mean, so the point is, innovation exhaustion comes from resisting change, right? Rather than embracing it. As soon as you embrace change, it's not a threat. It is how you live. So as a future, you know, for example, with COVID, so many people are having psychological disruptions because it's so altered their reality. And my reaction was, okay, great. This is, how do I figure it out? My whole business model to your workforce, people watching this and listening to this, you know, my whole business model, getting, you know, driving to the airport, going through 1 or 2 airports, getting on 1 or 2 planes, you know, taking an Uber, getting them picked up in a limo, going to a hotel or convention center, speaking to thousands of people, it went away. So, okay, so how do I flow into this new reality called the COVID and move forward? So that has been my obsession is, okay, what's the new model and how do I fit into it? And I've learned a whole lot. You know, that business is going away. I've got to create a new one. But it's inspirational. It's creative. It's like you wake up every day. Okay, so what do I need to learn to make this work? How do I do this? And the people who don't are the people who kind of go, oh, this is disruptive. I don't like this. You know, okay, so you're going to exhaust yourself. And I'm invigorating myself. So embracing change gets rid of exhaustion.
This sounds a bit like your Alvin Toffler quote at the beginning of your book.
So Alvin Toffler in 2006 was asked the question, what is education going to look like in this century? And he said the illiterate of the 21st century would not be those that cannot read and write, but those that cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So what that meant within a context of education is lifelong learning. You know, you're a lifelong learner. I'm a lifelong learner. We're both obsessive about books. We're what's new. You wouldn't be doing this if you weren't interested in the future, right? So the point is what I say to CEOs, and this is so important for your audience. The concept of unlearning is the most important, most verb that you have to do. You have to develop the ability to unlearn. You have to learn something, unlearn it, and relearn it. An educational example is when I graduated from college, probably before you were born. What do I want to call them? The commencement speakers. Sorry, took me a sec. It's early in the morning here. It's not. It's late in the afternoon where she is. So anyway, the commencement speakers in my era said, you might have more than one job in your lifetime, right? Because baby boomer parents had one job. Now graduates are being told you're going to have 3 to 5 careers, 2 or 3 of which are yet to exist. So how can you possibly educate for careers that don't exist? So lifelong learning, unlearning what you know to learn a new profession, unlearning the way you think about reality to embrace the new reality. So unlearning is the most important verb that your listeners and viewers need to master.
So as you speak of unlearning, and we spoke earlier about not resisting innovation, and then you won't have innovation exhaustion, that reminds me of the Bruce Lee quote, if you'd like to help us with that one.
Yeah, so I've got, the Bruce Lee quote is, be like water.
Mm.
And so the metaphor for me has been Bruce Lee since COVID. So Bruce Lee said, be like water. Water goes into a cup, it becomes the cup. It goes into the teapot, it becomes the teapot. It goes into the pan, it becomes the pan. So my thinking, and what I was just describing about being, how do I find my new business model, is be like water. So I myself and my profession have flowed into the COVID container. So this is my reality. How do I float in it? And of course he says, be like water. Water can crash, water can erode mountains, but water can be white water. So think of white water. The steeper the gravity, the faster the water goes. So that means if you're open and you're open to change, you're moving through white water, which means those boulders and stuff, you just move around them, right? So that's the way to not be exhausted. You don't slow down and try to move the boulder. You just flow past the obstruction, right? So be like water is such a great metaphor for adaptability, because nothing is more adaptive. Nothing changes more than water, right? It freezes, it moves, it becomes gas. All of that is water, right? So be like water is really the most adaptive way to think about change. The other quote I want to put in is, we should try to be the parents of our future rather than the offspring of our past.
I love that quote.
Yeah.
I love that quote. And I think I love that quote from a perspective that, from a people performance perspective, it's a good way of also instilling accountability. Because it's so easy to say, that's what I was taught. That's all that I know. Well, if you're going to carry your past with you like a little piece, like a little pebble or a stone, it's going to hold you back.
Yeah, but the point is that the definition of performance has to change too, right? Like it used to be 10 years ago, a salesman, a salesperson, saleswoman, salesman had to make 3 in-person presentations a day to get their numbers. Well, you can't do in-person presentations except through the screen reality, right? So performance as a metric shouldn't become rigid. It shouldn't be based on yesterday's performance, but on tomorrow's needs.
And how do we do that, oh wise one?
Well, you talk to a futurist, I've done dozens of corporate retreats, and the corporations who have universally, if a corporation brings a futurist in, that tells me that they're concerned about something, right? They're concerned about being at risk, or they're concerned about staying too much in one market, or whatever that is. So by the time they bring in a futurist, they think they're open to change. Then the real question becomes, and I know you advise companies, is how much will they change, even if they know you're right? Because most corporations get to a point in size where they have their own inherent institutional pathology. And that pathology keeps them from changing. Like if a corporation is taking the pathology of the C-suite, you can't vote them out of office. You have to leave. You have to either change the corporation or leave. And that's where performance comes in, because I've been very successful because I have taken the metrics of performance, like when I was selling TV time or when I was creating TV programs, to follow the definitions of what successful performance was. Once you become a successful performer in any corporation, you're invaluable. So even if it's a performance of sales numbers, if you get those sales numbers, which I always got the sales numbers, I had the freedom to do what I wanted, because, well, David will bring in the big deal. So I don't have to do it their way. I did it my way. So I got to be in between the client, the buyer, and the seller. Even though I was the seller, I turned around to the buyer and say, what is the problem you're having? And let me try to solve it for you, right? So performance is about gaining authority, independence, power, and success by both doing what the definition of performance is now if you're working with an entity, but figuring out how you can creatively add to that performance so you get some independence while you're still in the big beast. That's ultimately why I became an independent contractor, because I don't like playing games with people.
Yeah. Yes. And I think that's why many people become independent contractors, is also because what performance and what success is means different things to everyone.
Exactly. And I think COVID has really lifted the lid on humanism to some degree. In other words, I don't think there's anybody who hasn't gone through some reflection about their primary relationships, their secondary relationships, what's important, in realizing to me, the 9 to 5, that's a metaphor. The 9 to 5 work world is a collective hallucination that we've all bought into. If you think about the concept of rush hour, there's no such thing as rush hour. There's stop and go hour, because we all have to do it at the same time, right? So it's like that's blown up. So when the structural external reality blows up, the internal reality just comes right to the surface. So those that are busy being born are not busy dying, right? So that's why we're talking, because you like busy being born every day. You talk about reading books, and so that's why we're connecting. People who go, well, I don't know, I don't like it. Okay, fine, don't like it. Don't like it until you're so not liking your life that you will change your life.
Yes. And I think I mentioned to you earlier, one of my favorite quotes is that you can decide, do you want the pain of being stuck, or do you want the pain of growth and getting out of the stuck?
Yeah, although I wouldn't even put when a child grows, sometimes if they have rapid growth, there's painful growth things, but basically a child doesn't feel the pain of growing. No. It's more the parent feels the movement, from the day that a child is born till they get to be old folks like you and me, there's the constant movement there's the constant movement of independence, right? So as kids are growing up and changing, parents, he's going off to college, let's cry about it because he's changed, he's no longer a kid. And the kid doesn't feel that pain. The kid wants to get the hell to college, right? So there's really no pain in growth. I want people to understand that. I mean, how did you or I learn to walk, right? We just did it. And the only way to do it is to keep falling down, right?
Yeah.
No kid just stood up and walked. My message on a personal level is always embrace change, particularly in the 2020s. There's going to be more change, and I know we can talk about it at a higher level another time, but there's more change. There's going to be as much change from 2020 to 2030 as any 30 or 40-year period in human history. So there's a convergence of so many things right now that is going to happen in 10 years that normally would take 50 or 60 to fully work their way around the planet, because we're so much more connected. So there's no option but change.
So I hear what you're saying, and I think it brings us back to the reference on innovation exhaustion. If you're the water, there's no pain. Right. But I do think that very often, and you've sort of mentioned it in passing as well, that corporations, people, we hang on to something that is akin to our identity in whatever form that is. So I love speaking about my business as my child. So if my child was at risk during COVID, there would have been pain for me. There would have been growth as well, but there would have been pain as well. So I suppose, it depends on how much we can unlearn and let go.
Right. I mean, there's always difficult. I mean, what are the metaphors? The caterpillar becomes the butterfly. The snake sheds its skin every year. And I can't imagine a snake shedding its skin as being without pain. I mean, I don't know if snakes feel pain. They're vertebrates. They have nervous systems, but it must be somewhat odd. Or, my wife is a therapist, and she said just before the caterpillar thought life was over, it became a butterfly, right? I mean, that's such a perfect metaphor for human growth. So if you're feeling pain because there's too much change, you have to do things that open up the possibility of a better future. I mean, one of the things that, I always say I stand on the shoulders of the three great futurists the last 75 years, Alvin Toffler, Marshall McLuhan, and R. Buckminster Fuller. And Fuller set up utopia or oblivion, and we're in that fork in the road. So if we are frozen, we're going to go down the path of oblivion. If we can change, we can go towards utopia. And the reality of that is just, that's what the 2020s is. It's humanity's fork in the road. In fact, I was just writing something. Here's the quote. I'm going to pull the quote up from R. Buckminster Fuller from his 1970 book, Utopia, Oblivion. Whether it is to be utopia or oblivion will be a touch and go relay race right up to the final moment. Humanity is in, quote, final exam as to whether or not it qualifies for continuance in the universe. That's where we are in the 2020s.
And I think that's one of the big problems that we've seen here, and I'm sure it's been the same all over the world, that so many business leaders and so many business people did the freeze thing. I'm going to wait for COVID to go over, but now it's 5 months later and we only now exiting lockdown. And so, that's quite distressing, because that's almost created more trouble than just COVID, because
people seem to think that something will pass, right? That's like going back to normal. And the reality is, like in the United States, Trump hasn't done anything, right? So the only way we're going to change is to have somebody in who will make those changes and do the right thing. So that's why this is such a critical election. I've been saying to people, so we'll book into April because by then it should be over. I go, no, it's not going to be over. It's not going to be over. Americans at least are going to be living with masks and in some form of lockdown, at least for another year. That's why we've entered a depression, right? So the point is that if you think that change is temporary and it's going to revert back, you got problems ahead. In other words, I wrote a column recently that said it's not when the economy is going to bounce back, but how the economy is going to bounce forward. If you're on the forward trajectory, you're going to be fine. If you're waiting, it's not coming back. As a futurist, I've been talking about pandemics for a decade, right? I just didn't know what they would look like and when they would come and how they would break out, what the particulars are. So, given the incursion of humanity onto the natural habitat, we're going to have more viruses. We're going to have another COVID in this decade for sure. So, one of the ways to think about that, this is just a shock value for your viewers and listeners, is we may be, I'm in my early 70s. I'm in great shape. I do life extension, all that stuff, but I may be wearing a mask for the rest of my life in America and traveling the world. I can't imagine ever getting on a plane again without a mask. I can't imagine getting on a plane right now because I don't. Right. But so think about that. How psychologically did you just react when you heard me say you might be wearing a mask for the rest of your life? Whoa. That's a possibility. It's a possibility.
So it's so meaningful, and I'll tell you why that hit me so hard is because when COVID just started and it was known that it originated in China, the first thing that flashed into my mind was people walking around wearing masks, and I thought that must be the most surreal thing. Now, 5 months down the line, I own a couple of them, and just when you said that, I match my age to yours and think, well, I might, not even be working anymore before we stop wearing masks. It's like, wow, that was shock value. That was. But in between all of this, I want to quote Nelson Mandela, who said, and I paraphrase, he said, it's only impossible until someone does it.
Yeah.
And there's so much opportunity. There's so much that can be done. So we shouldn't freeze. I believe you'd have a matching quote for me from Arthur Schopenhauer.
The very first question was, how did I become a futurist? And so this is the quote that has carried me. So in other words, I'm always leaving the room of the past, going to the future. So I have arrows in my back all the time. That's stupid. That's not going to work, right? So literally since the 80s, Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, in the revelation of any truth, there are three stages. In the first, it is ridiculed. In the second, it is resisted. And in the third is considered self-evident. So the sun revolves around the earth. The earth is flat. Climate change is a hoax. Everything becomes self-evident, right? So the Mandela quote was really interesting. It triggered in my mind a column I wrote. Once something is done, it changes consciousness. It was thought up until 1952, I may have the date wrong, that it was impossible. It was impossible for a human to run a mile in under 4 minutes. So this great Brit, Roger Bannister, worked with a teammate who set a pace for him so that he could break the 4-minute mile. It had never been done until I think it was 52, might have been 53 or 54. I have to look that up. But he did 3:59.59. So 1/10 of a second, he beat it. Within 6 months, I think it was 6 different people took the number even lower because there was a consciousness that it could be done. The other example in track and field was 1968 in the Olympics in Mexico City. Higher altitude, so thinner air, so more records were broken. So the apocryphal story is that Ralph, God, I just blanked on the name. The long jumper. I want to say Ralph Boston. I may be wrong on that. He had put his hat where the world record was in the long jump pit, right? And as the story goes, a Mexican worker from the Olympic Committee was cleaning it up, saw the hat, and moved it 2 feet down for some reason, right? So the long jumper saw the hat and said, I got to jump the hat. So by jumping to the hat, it was the single greatest distance change in the history of the long jump by 2 feet rather than inches or quarter inches, just because he saw the hat. Yes. That performance, right? I mean, that is an example of performance where you see a goal that you believe is the world's record, but it's 2 feet past the world's record, and you jump 2 feet past the world's record. Think about rowing a boat. That's the way most people approach the future. They can tell you their story. In other words, they're backing into the future, right? Yeah. They can tell you their story. They can tell you their path. They can tell you where they graduated. They can tell you what they do well. They can tell you who they are. Ask them where they're going, and they have to turn around and look, right? Yes. So we have to turn and face the future. You have to row into it, eyes open.
It's that same concept of and I wouldn't be amazed if this comes from your book, but I can't remember where I got the quote. I can't see where I saw it. Is we manage our lives driving forward, but we're looking in the rearview mirror.
That is a quote. I lifted that and appropriated that from Marshall McLuhan. Most of the people drive down the freeway of life looking in the rearview mirror, right?
Yes. Indeed. So while I'm now just abusing your time entirely and having too much fun, education in the future, education for people in organizations, what's that going to look like?
Well, it is, again, education is one of the slowest moving parts of society. So it's completely out of step. So the Toffler quote, be a lifelong learner, always be learning, right? We know we moved into the knowledge economy We've moved out of the knowledge economy into the learning economy. Always be learning, right? So the concept of getting a college degree as enough is no longer valid. And so I wrote a book 10 years ago, Shift Ed, a Call to Action, Transforming K through 12. And I spent years talking about educators, and now I have the Sarasota Institute, a 21st century think tank, and I have 4 college presidents on the board, on my advisory board. And the idea is very simple, that everything has to change in terms of education. And COVID, just like in many other parts, COVID has accelerated the need to change across the board institutionally, but particularly in education. We just did in the Sarasota Institute, the 21st Century Think Tank, we did a symposium on K through 12, and one of the thought leaders, who's also still a school superintendent in the United States, said, David, K through 12, I've got people who are going to graduate in my system from high school by 2030. What are they going to need to know in the 2030s? And they don't need to know the history, right? You talked about before we powered up that you've externalized your brain on your iPad, right? So I have this iPhone, and I always talk about it is a concept. It's called the externalization of the mind. So I'm sure you're probably like me. You used to make lists, right? You make a list. That's externalizing the mind. And the most important part of the list you make is the list you make before you go to sleep, right? Here's the things I have to do tomorrow so I can forget about them so I can get a good night's sleep. This device and the iPad have taken it to the extreme. My son's name is Christopher. He lives in Amsterdam. I don't know his phone number. I just push his name, right? So we're increasingly externalizing our minds. So what this means is that the generation in K through 12 now, this is what they're going to be living on. So I fought a crusade 10 years ago, and now it's effectively done, where the majority of teachers will let students keep their smartphones on during class and use it, right? It's the single greatest, you're 2 click strokes away from all the world's knowledge. Why not use this rather than listen to the monotone of my middle-aged voice telling you what to write down? No, Johnny, you're going to look up this. Susie, you're going to look up this. Brad, you're going to look up this. And we're going to reconvene in 5 minutes and solve the problem together, right? So use the technology they're going to be using when they get out.
Is technology an equalizer for children at school?
Yes. If everybody has it. One of my soapboxes in the United States is because we have a low voter participation in the elections. The founding fathers of the United States created the one-room schoolhouse because they realized they needed to have an educated electorate. Well, today, an educated electorate means access to the internet. So my soapbox is, if any family that has all of its members of voting age 18 and over in the United States go out and vote, they should get free wireless for a year. That's the equalizer, is access to the internet. 86% of all humans over the age of 15 have a cell phone. There's more cell phones than there is more people have cell phones than have indoor plumbing or indoor electricity. So it is the great equalizer.
I agree with you. And the other interesting thing that we see, so I've traveled to India, and, in South Africa, we have places of abject poverty. And what we see there is satellite dishes, because, of course, we don't have cable, we have satellite. And the houses will be a shack that's built out of sticks and stones, but they will have satellite. And it's amazing how much that can do for education.
When I did a speaking tour of South Africa in 2011, I was at the high end, and I went to, I was given a tour, I think Soweto, which is the only street where 2 Nobel, right? But then they took me to the shanty town, right? That was all tin corrugated. And as we're driving up, I see the porta potties. And I said, how does that work? And I said, well, we'll let somebody. So then, I was the VIP. So I'm, get out of the SUV, and I'm talking to these young guys, and they speak 6 different languages, 4 of which are tribal, right? Yes. And they all have cell phones. And I said, so tell me about the porta potty. And they said every 8 families use one, and we each have a key. And once a week, the government comes and cleans them out. But they all had cell phones. They were talking on their cell phones, showing me the no electricity, no running water, right? So
Yes.
at that moment that it just went, here I am in a shanty town outside Soweto, and they all have cell phones, and they're all multilingual, right?
And it's so interesting because one of my clients is a COO of a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm.
And now with COVID, everyone's going, oh, but how are we going to get information into those areas, the porta potty areas? And she went, it's called WhatsApp. It's
Yeah, right, exactly.
WhatsApp. We're like,
right.
What are you worried about? We've got this. So
right.
it was beautiful.
Well, see, now that's a person who has to change because they think it's face to face.
Yes. But David, I've taken too much of your time. Thank you so much. It's been so great speaking to you.
Pleasure. And thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. And I think the Performance Cafe is great. And I think, the reason it's so important for you to be doing this is that the definition of performance is changing daily. So how to become a high performance person is an evolving answer.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Thanks so much to David for sharing such a great coffee with us. I'm sure you've learned a lot. If you have any questions or you'd like to reach out to him, he's at david@davidhoule.com. If you like this, please click subscribe or like the channel on Facebook or on LinkedIn. You can like, subscribe, and comment. And until then, I look forward to seeing you at the next Performance Cafe.